Welcome along to this video tutorial on developing your research aims and objectives. My name is Chris Gibbons from the School of Environmental and Geographical Sciences at the University of Nottingham, Malaysia. And in this presentation, I'm going to try and talk very generally about how to develop or approach the development of your research aims and objectives. By generally, what I mean is that I hope to be able to say things that are valuable across a range of different levels or types of research, from those people who are looking to develop their aims and objectives for undergraduate theses, undergraduate final year projects, through to those developing master's projects, all the way up to those who are developing aims and objectives for their PhD research. So general across a range of different levels, but also general across a range of different subject areas. I hope that what I have to say is useful, whether you're working in ecological or environmental science, in biological sciences, in engineering, or actually across in social science. I hope what I have to say allows you to approach the development of your aims and objectives with greater confidence. Now, 2 points to start with that help emphasize the importance, the significance of being clear about your aims and objectives. Firstly, having clear aims and objectives is important because it allows you to set the boundaries of your research, to delimit its scope, but also within those boundaries, within the area that you're going to be working, to specify some of the particular things, the objectives that you're going to be looking at. So it both sets the perimeter and also allows you to be a little bit more specific about what you're going to be doing within that perimeter. It allows you to say what you're going to be doing, but also by inference makes it clear what you're not going to be doing. And that's important because when someone is evaluating your research, they evaluate it against what you set out to do, not the things that you're not trying to do. So in order to allow them to judge it properly and fairly, it's important that you're clear about what it is that you're trying to do. The second reason why developing aims and objectives is important is because if you get them right, if you get them very clearly worded, very clearly articulated, then actually what you need to do methodologically in order to address them becomes a very easy next step to be able to make. The approach that you need to adopt or to follow follows on logically from a clear set of objectives. So they actually help you with the whole process. They will allow you, if you've got them right, to move seamlessly, to easily identify the methods that you need to adopt, and in turn the analyses that you need to apply in order to address each of your objectives. Now, I've already begun to touch on this, but it's important to take a step back at this stage and think a little bit about how your thesis is going to evaluate it. So the first thing, as I've already said, is that your thesis should be evaluated against what you set out to do. So you need to give the reader some help with this by being very clear about what it is that you're setting out to do. So for example, if you articulate through your aims that you're wanting to look at X, then it's X that you are assessed against, not whether you've addressed Y. So being clear allows the person evaluating your thesis to look fairly at what you've done and assess you against your aim and objectives rather than things that you've not set out to do. Secondly, and this is very important, and this is something that I think very often is a source of confusion, particularly for undergraduate students, is that in many ways what you actually find out through your research is not the main thing that's used in the evaluation. So for instance, if your research involves undertaking an environmental impact assessment of some major infrastructure development project, whether you find that it does have an impact or is likely to have an impact, or whether you find that it doesn't have an impact or is not likely to have an impact, that really doesn't matter. What you're evaluated against is whether the conclusion you reach, whatever that is well substantiated by the data that you have, the data that you've amassed, and the analyses that you've applied to those data, and the fact that your aims and objectives have been set up in a way that allows you to properly address the issue it is that you're looking at. So really what you're assessed against is the coherence of your work as a piece of research, because really what a research project is about from the perspective of someone preparing a thesis is demonstrating your capacity as a researcher. And demonstrating your capacity as a researcher is not about finding the answer, it's about demonstrating that you can implement a set of methods following on logically from clear aims and objectives that allow you to get to that answer. Whatever that answer is, or what the answer is, in itself isn't important. Your thesis is about demonstrating a process, and the start of that process is being clear about aims and objectives. So what I'm going to talk about in this presentation is the difference between aims and objectives, and I'm then going to go on to talk about how these things, how aims and objectives relate to, or the extent to which, or the different ways in which aims and objectives link to research questions and or research hypotheses. So let's jump straight in. What do we mean by a research aim? Well, your research aim is a statement that sets out the overarching broad purpose of the research that you are planning to do or that you're setting out to do. So it's a general statement that explains the goal of the research. So it's all embracing, and it's all embracing in the sense that it's highly likely to contain a number of more specific elements. And those specific elements are actually your objectives. So we can think about the objectives of being the more specific, and this is important, measurable, the measurable things that you're needing to do in order to address or achieve your overall aim. And so we can think of the objectives as being more specific things that sit beneath or that nest within your overarching aim. And also, and this is very important, we can think about this idea that once these objectives are all done, once you've ticked them all off, then by definition, you've achieved your overall aim. So in other words, you don't need to do any more to achieve your aim other than fully addressing your objectives. So here's an example, and I've chosen an example from my own field of research. I'm an environmental scientist, and a lot of the work that I do concerns looking to try and understand the ecological and wider environmental impacts of water resources development projects such as dams. So here's an image on the screen here of Mequinenza Dam, which is a dam in Catalonia in the northeastern part of Spain. And we might have a research aim which is to assess the environmental impacts of this particular dam of Mequinenza Dam. A couple of things to note here, going back to the point I made earlier about how this statement sets the boundary. So here the boundary is that we're looking at environmental impacts. We're not looking at social impacts. We're not looking at economic impacts. Also, the boundary is specified by the fact that we are focusing only on Mequinenza Dam. We're not interested in all dams. So this aim sets the perimeter, if you like. It sets the boundary of what we're doing. It sets out the scope of the work. However, it remains rather broad, so we need to be a little bit more specific about the things that we're going to do in order to fully understand or assess the environmental impacts of this particular dam. Now, a little bit of context here before we look at these in more detail. So if we're going to understand the environmental effects of a dam, we need to recognise that there are some effects that relate to the place where the dam itself is constructed. In other words, there are impacts in the area that eventually, once the dam is completed, the area that's inundated by the lake itself, by the reservoir itself. But also, because of the way dams release water, then there are also impacts on the downstream river. But there are a number of different types of effect on the downstream river. And so these 4 objectives allow us to address both the impacts in the area occupied or inundated by the lake, but also different types of effects on the downstream river. So we've got the first of these bullet points, the first of our objectives, is about understanding the impacts in the area occupied by the reservoir, and then the next 3 are looking at the downstream river. The first looking at its flow regime, the second looking at its sediment dynamics, the second looking at impacts on fish and invertebrates. And so, to reiterate my point, once we've completed all 4 of these objectives, then we've achieved the overall aim, because together these allow us to assess the overall environmental impacts of Mequinenza Dam. Notice the phraseology. When we articulate our objectives, we're saying we're going to be doing something or we're going to do something. Now, of course, precisely what it is you're going to do depends on the nature of the research. Some research is exploratory, some's a little bit more descriptive, some's more explanatory, it's trying to understand mechanisms. Sometimes research is comparative, sometimes it's predictive. So the precise terms that you might choose to use depend a little bit on what it is that you're going to do, but notice here the sorts of things that we might say: to investigate, to describe, to compare, to predict. They're about doing things. So these are examples of the sorts of ways in which you might begin to phrase your individual objectives. Now, I'm sure you've all heard to some degree about SMART objectives, and SMART objectives are things that in general I think are useful, or the idea of objectives needing to be SMART is I think a useful idea. However, there's a little bit of confusion or uncertainty or ambiguity about what exactly SMART objectives are, or more particularly what each of the letters in this acronym actually stand for. So just to illustrate that uncertainty or ambiguity, I've pulled out a couple of examples of how the notion of SMART objectives is articulated on different websites. So on the left hand side, I just screen dumped a picture of a dartboard that's used to illustrate the acronym SMART, and on the right hand side a different articulation from a different website about what's meant by SMART objectives. So notice on the dartboard we've got SMART being specific, measurable, achievable, realistic and timely. Great, that all seems to make sense. On the right hand side, on a different website, we've got specific, measurable, achievable. Great, they seem to coincide. But then the R on the right hand side is different. Rather than realistic, it's relevant. And the T on the right hand side, rather than meaning timely, it's explained as time-based. And in my mind, something which is timely and something which is time-based are quite different things. If you look at how time-based is explained on the right, it's about setting something which is realistic within the available time frame. But actually, to me, that's something which is about setting an objective which is achievable, but we've already got achievable as the A. So there's a little bit of uncertainty here that isn't too helpful for someone trying to, for the first time in particular, develop their aims and objectives. What do these things really stand for, and how can we interpret them within the context of research? Well, to help with that, I've set out my specification, but actually rather than just specifying each of the letters, I've added an extra couple that I think help us a little bit more specifically within the context of research. And I've tried to be as clear and helpful as I can in terms of defining what we mean for each letter of the acronym. So by S we mean specific, and objectives need to be narrow enough to give a clear focus, and they also need to be narrow enough so that they make it very clear what you need to do in order to address them or collect or obtain the necessary data or information. They need to be measurable, because you need to know, you need to be able to tick off when you've reached the point where you have fully addressed each of your objectives. So you need to know that you've achieved them, and you need to be able to demonstrate that you've achieved them, or rather the person evaluating your thesis needs to be able to see, because your objectives are measurable, they need to be able to see that you've achieved them. They need to be achievable, and by achievable, of course, we're meaning something that's realistic within the time frame. And of course, the time frame varies. If you're an undergraduate student, you're working to a very different timeline to if you're a postgraduate or particularly a PhD student. So what's achievable for an undergraduate student is very different to what's achievable for a PhD. And so you need to set objectives that are essentially doable within the time frame. You don't need to be over ambitious. They need to be additive, and this is my extra A in green. And what I mean by this is they need to sum up such that once you've achieved them, they all connect to your aim. But once you've achieved them, this is trying to be clear about this idea that once you've achieved them, then indeed you've been able to address the overall aim in its totality. And so there shouldn't be anything missing. So for instance, for my assessment of the dam, if one of those objectives was missing, then I wouldn't really have been able to claim that I was wholly addressing the environmental effects. But once they're all in, once they're all added in, then once they're completed, once they're achieved, then they sum to allow me to claim that I've delivered or achieved my overall aim. Of course, they need to be relevant. They need to link to your aim. So it needs to be very clear that you're not going beyond your perimeter for any particular objective. They need to be timely, and what I mean by here within the research context is that you're addressing a knowledge gap. So there's a need, a current need to do this work. And then finally, the extra T that I've added in, the green T, is ideally your research in one way or another should be tied or linked to theory. Ideally, your research might involve testing theory or refining theory or even developing theory. And the reason I've added this in is because it allows you to move your research from something that might just be seen as a case study that's perhaps of only local interest to something of which is, by virtue of dealing with theory that transcends location, something that's relevant no matter where you're doing the work or wherever the reader is, then you're able to do something that's truly and genuinely going to be interesting to people in different places. So linking to theory allows you to do something that's truly international in its relevance. And that, particularly when it comes to publication, is something that's going to allow you to publish in an international journal rather than something that's perhaps designed for more local interest or more local users. So if you can, try and tie in or connect your objectives in one way or another to theory. So that's all I wanted to say about aims and objectives. But what about these things that we refer to as research questions and hypotheses? Well, there are a couple of different ways that we can look at this. And the first is by recognizing that actually each objective can be rephrased such that it becomes a question. So each objective can be turned into a question. So here's an example. And for this example, I'm going to use my River Ebro work, or the impacts of the dam on the Ebro River. So one of our objectives for that research project, for the project that had the aim of looking at the environmental impacts of Mequinenza. So one of the objectives was to evaluate how the dam has modified the Ebro River's flow regime. And we can simply rephrase that so that it becomes a research question. How has the dam modified the Ebro River's flow regime? So that objective is now a question. So we can very easily do that. And of course, what that allows us to see is that really you don't need both objectives and questions, because they can, with a slight tweak of the phraseology or terminology, you can turn one into the other. So really you don't need both. Either or will suffice. Either have objectives or questions. I don't think in the majority of cases that you necessarily need both. Okay then, what about research hypotheses? Well, what I would say here is that all research needs aims and objectives, or at least an aim and some questions, but not all research is hypothesis driven, particularly more exploratory research, and a lot of research in social science isn't driven by the desire to test a particular hypothesis. So not all research necessarily has to have a hypothesis or has to be built around testing one or other hypotheses. But if you do have hypotheses, then of course there are a number of things that you need to ensure. Firstly, your hypotheses should demonstrably connect to your objectives or questions. And if they do, then of course they're allowing you to clarify certain things, or to clarify specific things that sit within your overall aim. And more broadly, they should adhere to the general rules about hypotheses. Hypotheses need to be things that you can truly test, and to work from the scientific perspective, they need to be something that's refutable. You need to be able to refute them for them to be truly useful in a research context, or be useful within the context of a research project. So here's an example. So we have our objective to assess the effects of the dam on fish in the Ebro River. Great. And we might wish to use a couple of hypotheses to help us with that particular assessment. So we've got hypothesis 1, fish abundance in the river downstream from the dam is lower than it is upstream. So we would develop a data collection process that allowed us to compare fish size upstream from downstream from the dam. So our methods follow logically from the objective, and in this instance from the hypothesis that's connected to that objective. Our second hypothesis, fish downstream from the dam, are smaller, so slightly different to the first one. The first one we're looking at abundance, the second one we're looking at fish size. They're both ways in which the dam could affect fish, but they are both connected to this particular objective. So we can connect our hypotheses to objectives, and they allow us to understand a little bit more, in this instance, of how the dam might be affecting fish in the river. Sometimes, however, the research itself aims to test or apply or even develop theory. And so hypotheses or hypotheses testing, rather than sitting within an individual objective, sit at a much higher level within the overall research project, or in other words, they're much more an explicit part of the overall aim than being nested within individual objectives. So, for example, we might have a research project that's interested to understand patterns of bird diversity, avian diversity. So I live and work in Malaysia, so I'll use an example from Malaysia. We might have a research project that aims to test some of the predictions that come out of island biogeographic theory. So, for example, we might have an aim which is to assess whether avian bird diversity on the islands off the coast of Kedah, which is in northern peninsular Malaysia, whether those patterns of diversity match the predictions of island biogeographic theory. So here we have an aim which is explicitly about testing some predictions that come from theory. Or sometimes our research aims to test a specific hypothesis. So again, let's follow the bird example. We might have an aim which is to assess whether avian species richness, bird species richness on islands furthest from the mainland, and this again connects to island biogeographic theory, whether bird species richness on islands that are furthest from the mainland is lower than those on islands that are closer to the mainland. So this is testing one of the specific hypotheses that comes out from island biogeographic theory. So this is an example of where actually a hypothesis, rather than being nested down within individual objectives, is actually right up and it is the overall aim of the research itself. So hypotheses can sit at different levels within a research project. So obviously this is something that as the researcher you need to think about, and the solution to this connects to the idea of you being clear what the particular knowledge gap is that you're trying to address. So let me close by reiterating a couple of points that I've tried to emphasize during this presentation. First and foremost, being clear about your aims and objectives is important for many reasons. They allow you to demonstrate to the person assessing your thesis or the person evaluating your thesis that you know how to approach the research from a methodological perspective. In other words, you know how to conduct research, you know how to move from the identification of a gap through to the development and articulation of clear aims and objectives, and in turn from those identify a set of suitable methods or approaches that allow you to address those objectives. So they're essential to help the person evaluating your thesis evaluate it fairly, but also they're helpful for you. They allow you to be clear in your own mind precisely about what it is that you're trying to do and also what you're not trying to do, and that then allows you to confidently develop an approach or a set of methods that are going to give you the information that you need in order to achieve your aims. So they help you collect the necessary data, they help you avoid wasting time doing things that are not necessary, they help you avoid doing things that are outside of your scope or outside of your remit. So overall, if you get them right and you prioritize these things or prioritise being clear about them right from the beginning, overall they will smooth and speed up the passage to a nice, clear thesis and a successful defence or a positive evaluation of your thesis. Thank you for listening, and I hope that's been a nice, clear articulation of what we mean by aims, objectives, and some of the differences between aims and objectives and these things that you often hear about being as being similar but not precisely the same as aims and objectives. So I hope now that the distinction between all of these things is now nice and clear. Thanks for listening.